Rochester, New York, 1975. Inside a hushed laboratory deep within the hallowed halls of Eastman Kodak, the undisputed global empire of photography, a small group of executives leaned in, not with alarm, but with a patronizing curiosity. Before them, a young engineer named Stephen Sasson stood beside a clumsy toaster-sized contraption wired to a television set. After a painstaking 23-second exposure and the whirring of a standard cassette tape, a ghostly 100x100 pixel black and white image etched itself onto the screen. It was a crude, flickering specter, a technological infant barely able to crawl. To the men who commanded a world built on the rich, tangible magic of silver halide and glossy paper,
Rochester,
this was not a threat. It was a novelty. They called it cute. They saw an interesting science project, a technical exercise, with no conceivable market against the vibrant emotional power of a Kodak moment. What these titans of industry failed to comprehend was that the box in front of them was not a toy, but a weapon pointed directly at the heart of their empire. They were holding the future in their hands and saw only a harmless curiosity. In that sterile room, under the hum of fluorescent lights, the first shot in a war they didn't even know had begun was fired. They were witnessing the birth of the ghost that would haunt their boardrooms, dismantle their factories, and ultimately bring their century-old kingdom crashing to its knees. That casual dismissal, that patronizing label of cute, could only have come from a place of absolute unshakable power. To understand the depth of Kodak's blindness is to first stand in awe of the fortress they had built, a fortress not of stone and steel, but of chemistry, culture, and a near-religious devotion to the physical image. This was not merely a company. It was the global custodian of human memory, and its dominance was built upon a doctrine as elegant and ruthless as any military strategy ever devised. The foundation of this empire, the very source of its invincibility, was a perfected art form of commerce known as the razor and blades model. It was a strategy of breathtaking simplicity and staggering profitability. The camera, the razor, was often sold at a modest price, sometimes even a loss. It was the invitation, the accessible entry point into their world. But once you were in, you were theirs. The real prize, the lifeblood of the empire, was the blades, the endless recurring need for Kodak film, Kodak photographic paper, and Kodak's proprietary developing chemicals. It was a golden loop, a perpetual engine of profit that fed itself. Every birthday party, every graduation, every vacation, every newborn's first smile was a transaction. You didn't just buy a Kodak camera. You subscribed to the Kodak ecosystem for life. This brilliant economic model was fortified by a technological advantage that bordered on alchemy, Kodachrome. It was more than just a product. It was a legend. In an era before digital manipulation, Kodachrome was magic. It rendered colors with a depth and vibrancy that felt more real than reality itself. Its archival quality was unparalleled. Slides shot on Kodachrome in the 1940 seconds remain as vivid today as the day they were processed, tiny windows into a past that refused to fade. This was Kodak's ultimate weapon. While competitors produced serviceable film, Kodak produced heirlooms. The process to unlock these colors was a closely guarded secret, a complex ritual known as the K14 process that required specialized machinery and a symphony of chemical baths. You could not develop Kodachrome in a local drugstore or a home darkroom. You had to send it back to the masters, back to the high priests in Rochester. This sealed the loop. They sold you the razor, they sold you the blades, and they held the exclusive key to sharpening them. The results of this strategy were not just successful, they were absolute. By the mid-1970 seconds, at the very moment Stephen Sasson was tinkering with his digital prototype Kodak, commanded an astonishing 90% of the film market and 85% of the camera market in the United States. This wasn't market share. It was a cultural annexation. The very act of taking a picture had become synonymous with their name. The phrase, "a Kodak moment," was not a marketing slogan. It was a deeply ingrained piece of the American lexicon. It was a universal signal for a moment, so precious, so fleeting that it demanded preservation. It spoke of family reunions on sun-drenched lawns, of proud fathers and beaming brides, of the irreplaceable tapestry of life itself. Kodak wasn't selling celluloid and chemicals. They were selling nostalgia. They were selling permanence. They were selling the promise that a moment could be captured, held, and shielded from the relentless erosion of time. Their yellow and red boxes were ubiquitous beacons of memory found in every drawer, every closet, every attic across the nation. They were as much a part of the American home as the family Bible or the television set. This was the empire that looked upon that first crude digital image and saw no threat. How could they? Their entire world was built on the tangible. Their profits were tied to physical rolls of film, to sheets of paper, to gallons of chemicals. Their brand was built on the emotional weight of a photograph you could hold in your hand, passed down through generations, and discovered decades later in a dusty shoebox. The idea of an image as a fleeting stream of ones and zeros, an ephemeral ghost in a machine, was not just alien, it was heretical. It contradicted every pillar of their success, every chapter of their gospel. The executives in that room were not fools. They were emperors, standing on the ramparts of a perfect, magnificent fortress, looking out at a world they completely and utterly owned. Their vision was obscured by the blinding glare of their own success. The foundation of their dominance was so absolute, so deeply embedded in the very fabric of society that it had become a prison of thought. The fortress they had built was perfect. The only flaw was its refusal to acknowledge that the world outside its walls was about to change forever. The fortress that Kodak built was so perfect, its walls so high, and its treasury so full, that its gatekeepers saw no need to look for threats within. The ultimate irony, the cruelest twist in this corporate tragedy, is that the seeds of its destruction were not sown by a rival in Tokyo or a startup in a distant garage. They were nurtured in the fertile soil of its own sacred labs, watered by its own research dollars, and brought to life by one of its own loyal engineers. The ghost that would one day haunt and dismantle the empire was, in fact, born at home. His name was Stephen Sasson, a young electrical engineer who in 1973 was given a broad, almost aimless task to explore the practical applications of a new technology called the charge-coupled device, or CCD. It was a solution in search of a problem. Sasson, driven by a pure, untainted curiosity, embarked on a 2-year journey that would culminate in a moment of world-changing invention. The device he created was not elegant. It was a Frankenstein's monster of technology, a clumsy chimera built from a kludge of borrowed parts. The lens was scavenged from a used Super 8 movie camera. The digital converter was an off-the-shelf component. The memory was a standard audio cassette tape. And the body was a hulking 8-pound blue box, wired to a heavy power supply. It was the very antithesis of the sleek, user-friendly Brownie and Instamatic cameras that had made Kodak a household name. The process was just as graceless. To capture an image, the contraption required a full 23 seconds of exposure in black and white. The CCD would gather the light, and the machine would then laboriously convert the analog signal into digital data, which was recorded onto the cassette tape with a series of high-pitched whirs and clicks. To see the result, the tape had to be removed and placed into a custom-built playback unit connected to a television. After another 30 seconds of processing, a ghostly quilt of 10000 pixels, a crude 100x100 mosaic would slowly materialize on the screen. The first subject of this revolutionary process was a lab assistant named Joy. The image that appeared was a grainy, low-resolution phantom, barely recognizable. It was by every existing photographic standard a failure. But it was a filmless photograph. It was the first echo of the future. Brimming with the nervous pride of an inventor, Sasson and his team began a roadshow presenting their creation to the various heads of Kodak's powerful divisions. The reaction was universally, chillingly consistent. In room after room they were met not with excitement or alarm, but with a polite, almost pitying curiosity. The executives' men, whose entire careers had been forged in the fires of chemical processing and the tactile beauty of the printed image, looked at the flickering black and white apparition on the screen and saw nothing. They saw no artistry. They saw no commercial value. They saw none of the emotional resonance that defined a Kodak moment. Their minds, conditioned by a century of market dominance, simply could not bridge the chasm between the vibrant soul of Kodachrome and this pale digital ghost. Their questions revealed their deep-seated bias. Why would anyone want to look at a picture on a television screen? One asked, genuinely perplexed. The concept of a digital photo frame, a computer monitor, or a smartphone screen was a science fiction fantasy. The world they knew consisted of photo albums, shoeboxes filled with prints, and the warm glow of a slide projector against a living room wall. Another executive representing the colossal marketing division pointed out the obvious flaw. "When are we going to see this?" he asked, tapping the screen. The 30-second delay was an eternity compared to the instant gratification of a Polaroid or the anticipated magic of opening a fresh envelope of prints from the developer. But the most damning reaction came from their core business instinct. They looked at Sassen's filmless camera and asked the one question that sealed its fate. How does this make money? Their entire empire was built on the annuity of film sales. This heretical device proposed a world without their golden goose. It didn't just fail to fit into their business model. It was a declaration of war against it. And so the verdict came down famously and fatally. "That's cute," one executive said, delivering the line that would become the epitaph of an empire, but don't tell anyone about it. It was a command born not of malice but of fear and a catastrophic failure of imagination. They didn't smash the device or fire the engineer. They did something far more telling. They classified the report, patented the technology in 1978 to prevent anyone else from developing it, and then carefully buried it deep within their corporate archives. They believed they had contained the threat. They believed they had captured this strange new ghost, put it in a bottle, and could control when or if it would ever be released. They treated the future as if it were a trade secret they could lock away in a vault. In their hubris, they thought they had bought themselves time. In reality, they had just started the countdown on a time bomb of their own creation, oblivious to the fact that thousands of similar ghosts were about to be summoned in garages and laboratories all across the world. For a time, the ghost remained in the bottle. Through the 1,980 seconds, Kodak's fortress of film stood unbreached, its profits soaring to new heights, its cultural dominance absolute. The digital patent was a footnote in their archives, a curiosity locked away while the real world continued to buy film by the billions. But a ghost cannot be contained by a patent, and a revolution cannot be stopped by a corporate committee. While Kodak slept confident in the security of its empire, the world outside its walls was beginning to hum with a new kind of energy. The cracking of the bottle was not a single loud event, but 1,000 tiny fissures appearing all at once. The 1,990 seconds arrived, and with them came the storm. This was Kodak's Guadalcanal, a brutal, protracted battle fought on a new kind of terrain, where their old tactics were not just ineffective, but suicidal. The enemy did not appear as a single unified fleet. They were a swarm of nimble destroyers emerging from the technological fog. Sony, a master of consumer electronics, saw the digital camera not as a replacement for photography, but as the next evolution of the Walkman or the camcorder, a must-have electronic gadget. Canon, a giant in optics and office equipment, leveraged its expertise in lenses and printers to create a seamless digital imaging ecosystem. And then there was Fujifilm Kodak's eternal shadow. Facing the same existential threat, Fujifilm made a terrifyingly different choice. Instead of clinging to the wreckage of the past, they looked at their core competencies, chemical engineering, and pivoted with breathtaking speed, diversifying into medical imaging, LCD screen components, and even cosmetics. They saw that the war for film was already lost and began fighting a new one for survival. Kodak, the mighty battleship of the industry, finally stirred from its slumber. To their credit, they did not ignore the threat entirely. They saw the enemy ships on the horizon. But their response was a masterclass in strategic paralysis, a fatal attempt to fight a new war with an old map. They entered the digital camera market, and with their immense brand recognition and R&D budget, they produced some genuinely good products. The Kodak EasyShare line, launched in 2001, was a commercial success, lauded for its simplicity and user-friendly design. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if the giant had awakened and would crush the upstarts. But this was a tragic illusion. Kodak was not trying to win the digital war. They were trying to force the digital war to conform to their old rules of engagement. Their entire digital strategy was a Trojan horse, designed to smuggle their old business model into the new era. They poured hundreds of millions into developing user-friendly digital cameras and brilliant marketing campaigns. But the ultimate goal was always the same: to get people to print. The EasyShare camera dock wasn't just a convenience. It was an umbilical cord designed to tether the new digital world back to the familiar profitable womb of the photo finishing kiosk. They built online photo sharing websites like oPhoto, but their primary purpose was to serve as a storefront for ordering physical prints. They saw the digital image not as the final product, but as a glorified negative, a temporary step on the path to the real money-making object, a 4x, 6-inch piece of glossy Kodak paper. They were building high-speed trains, but insisting they run on their old winding horse and buggy tracks. This was the moment the reversal became undeniable. The true revolution of digital photography was not filmlessness. It was frictionlessness. The rise of the personal computer and the explosion of the internet created a new paradigm. A photograph was no longer just an object. It was data. It could be shared instantly, globally, at virtually no cost via an email attachment. It could be stored by the thousands on a hard drive. It could be displayed on a screen and then disappear. This was the torpedo that struck Kodak below the waterline. The very concept of sharing a photo without printing it, without a single cent flowing back to Rochester, was anathema to their entire existence. While Kodak was desperately trying to sell more paper, the rest of the world was falling in love with the magic of dematerialization. The battle was over before Kodak's leadership even realized they were losing. Each EasyShare camera they sold was a Pyrrhic victory, accelerating the adoption of digital while yielding razor-thin profit margins that could never replace the ocean of revenue from film. They were simultaneously arming the public with the weapons of the new age while praying they would continue to fight in the old way. It was a hopeless, contradictory strategy. The market had made its choice. The decline in film sales, which had been a gentle slope, suddenly became a terrifying cliff. The point of no return had been passed. The advantage had not just shifted, it had been completely and irrevocably reversed. Kodak, the master of the captured moment, had been caught in a moment of its own, a brutal clarifying instant, where the blinding light of the future revealed that their magnificent fortress was in fact a tomb. That magnificent fortress crumbled not because its walls were weak or its soldiers disloyal, but because the very ground beneath it had liquefied. The reversal was so total, so devastatingly complete, because the chasm that opened between Kodak and the new digital world was not a simple technological gap. It was a fundamental soul-deep divergence in thinking and structure, and in the very definition of what a photograph was. To analyze this gulf is to witness an autopsy of an empire revealing that the fatal wound was not inflicted by a single enemy weapon, but by a systemic internal failure to evolve. On the surface, the technological disparity seemed manageable. Kodak, after all, had invented the core technology. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, their engineers produced sensors and processors that were competitive and sometimes even superior to those of their rivals. The image quality from a high-end Kodak digital camera was often excellent. But this was a deceptive and ultimately irrelevant metric. Kodak was fighting a war of megapixels and color accuracy, believing that the best image would win. They were tragically wrong. Their competitors were fighting a war of speed, connectivity, and integration. While Kodak obsessed over perfecting the individual frame, companies like Sony and Canon were building an ecosystem. They understood that the digital camera was not a standalone device. It was a node in a rapidly expanding network of computers, printers, and nascent online platforms. Their cameras featured faster processors, more intuitive menu systems, and better battery life. They were electronics companies first and camera companies second. Kodak, with its century-long legacy in chemistry, was a camera company desperately trying to learn how to be an electronics company, and the difference was painfully obvious in every product they shipped. They were selling a perfect picture. Their rivals were selling a seamless experience. This technological disconnect was a symptom of a much deeper disease, a catastrophic organizational mismatch. Kodak was a monolithic, vertically integrated giant from a bygone industrial era. It was a chemical company. Its infrastructure was a sprawling testament to the age of analog massive factories with towering smokestacks dedicated to coating film, colossal chemical vats, and a global logistics network designed to move billions of physical country objects. Its corporate structure was just as rigid, a top-down hierarchy where the powerful film division was king. This division, the source of over 70% of the company's profits, acted like a feudal lord, jealously guarding its resources and vetoing any initiative that smelled of cannibalizing its sacred revenue stream. Any executive who championed a truly aggressive digital-first strategy was seen as a traitor to the crown. The company was a battleship, powerful and majestic in a straight line, but utterly incapable of making the sharp, nimble turns required in the chaotic waters of the digital revolution. In stark contrast, their competitors were built for the new age. They were modular, agile, and decentralized. Sony could leverage its PlayStation division's knowledge of processing power. Canon could tap into its printer division to create a perfect home printing solution. They outsourced manufacturing to nimble factories across Asia, allowing them to iterate designs and slash prices with a speed that Kodak's gargantuan unionized Rochester plants could never match. They were not beholden to a single sacred cow like film. Their revenue came from a diverse portfolio of electronics, and they were free to chase the digital future with a singular, ferocious focus. They saw digital not as a threat to be managed, but as a once-in-a-century opportunity to be seized. Kodak was an army of chemists and mechanical engineers trying to fight a war against armies of software programmers and electrical engineers. The very DNA of the organizations was different. But the most profound chasm, the one from which all other failures flowed, was the abyss that separated their strategic thinking. Kodak was trapped in what Clayton Christensen would later call the innovator's dilemma. Their very success had become their cage. Their entire worldview was defined by the tangible, the physical product, the per-unit profit, the beauty of an object you could hold. They viewed the world through the lens of atoms. Their strategy was to protect this world at all costs. The digital world, however, was a world of bits, ephemeral, infinitely reproducible, and valuable not for its physical form, but for its ability to be shared. Kodak's leaders, brilliant men who had masterfully managed the analog empire, simply could not make this mental leap. They saw the internet and saw a new, more efficient way to sell prints. They saw social media and saw a threat to the family photo album. They were trying to pour the boundless ocean of digital information into their small, profitable, and increasingly irrelevant bottles of paper and ink. Their rivals saw something entirely different. They saw a future where the camera itself might become a commodity, but the ecosystem around it would be priceless. They understood that in a world of infinite digital copies, the value shifted from the object to the network. They were laying the groundwork for a world of cloud storage, online galleries, and instant sharing, a world where profit would come from services and platforms, not just hardware. This wasn't just a different strategy. It was a different philosophy. It was the fundamental difference between a company trying to preserve its past and companies trying to invent the future. The chasm was no longer just a gap. It was a parallel universe. Kodak stood on one side, clutching its perfect, profitable, and obsolete Kodachrome slides, while the rest of the world was rocketing away into a new dimension on the other. The existence of two parallel universes cannot be sustained. One must inevitably collapse into the other. For Kodak, standing on the wrong side of that dimensional chasm, the end was not a single explosive event, but a slow, agonizing implosion. It was the crushing, inevitable surrender of a world built on atoms to a world governed by bits. The final years were a desperate, tragic ballet of decline, a series of last-ditch maneuvers by a once-great battleship, its hull breached and its engines failing, trying to stave off the cold, dark embrace of the abyss. The new millennium, a milestone that should have heralded a bright future, instead became a funeral dirge for the film industry. The numbers, once a source of immense pride, now became instruments of torture, charting the company's death spiral with brutal clinical precision. Film sales, the lifeblood of the empire for over a century, didn't just decline. They fell off a cliff. The revenue that had built the city of Rochester, funded generations of research, and made Kodak a synonym for memory itself, began to evaporate as if it had never existed. In 2000, film was still a vibrant multi-billion-dollar industry. By 2010, it was a niche hobbyist market, a ghost of its former self. In response, Kodak began a painful and protracted process of amputation. The smokestacks that had once billowed with a confident haze of industry began to go cold. Massive manufacturing plants, cities unto themselves, were shuttered and sold for scrap. The layoffs began as a trickle and soon became a flood. Tens of thousands of loyal employees, men and women, who had dedicated their entire lives to the Great Yellow Father, were cast out. These were not just jobs. They were identities, family traditions passed down through generations. The social fabric of an entire city began to unravel, a microcosm of the corporate devastation. Each factory closing, each round of layoffs, was a fresh wound from which the company's spirit bled out. There were moments of desperate, flailing hope. They tried to reinvent themselves, chasing one fleeting trend after another. They entered the inkjet printer market, a brutal, low-margin business in a vain attempt to reclaim their printing heritage. They initiated massive multi-billion-dollar patent lawsuits against rivals like Apple and Samsung, trying to monetize the very innovations they had failed to commercialize. It was the final tragic irony. The ghost they had bottled up and ignored was now being summoned in a courtroom, not as a product, but as a legal weapon to generate cash to pay for the severance packages of the employees who could have built it. These were not the actions of a visionary company. They were the frantic convulsions of a dying organism. The numbers told the final, unsparing story. A company whose stock had once been the bluest of blue chips, a bedrock of any respectable investment portfolio, saw its value disintegrate. From a peak market capitalization of over $30 billion in the late 1990s, the stock plummeted, eventually trading for pennies, a sad joke on the Wall Street ticker. In 2003, they posted their first annual loss in decades. It would not be their last. The red ink flowed year after agonizing year. The once mighty profits from film, which had papered over so many strategic errors, were gone, and the harsh reality of their failed digital ventures was laid bare. The final inevitable blow came on the 19th of January 2012. On that cold winter morning, Eastman Kodak, the 131-year-old icon of American industry, the company that had put a camera in every home and defined the very act of remembering, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Protection. It was a stunning, almost unthinkable capitulation. The fortress had fallen. The battleship had finally slipped beneath the waves. The lesson of Kodak's demise is both simple and terrifying, and it echoes through the boardrooms of every dominant company today. It is a stark, brutal warning that success is not a destination. It is a temporary state. Kodak's failure was not a failure of technology. They invented the camera that would kill them. It was not a failure of talent. Their labs were filled with brilliant minds. It was a failure of vision, a deep cultural inability to imagine a world that was different from the one they so profitably and completely dominated. They were so busy protecting their past that they failed to invent their future. The tragedy is that they saw the change coming. They had the patent, the research, the market position. They had a 15-year head start, but they were held captive by what made them great. Their razor and blades business model was so successful, so intoxicatingly profitable, that it became a golden cage from which they could not and would not escape. They chose to manage a comfortable decline rather than embrace a chaotic and uncertain rebirth. They clung to the familiar warmth of the physical photograph, while the world was racing toward the frictionless freedom of the digital image. In the end, the ghost that Steven Sasson had summoned in that quiet lab in 1975 could not be contained. It slipped through the boardroom doors, seeped through the factory walls, and remade the world in its own image. The story of Kodak is a timeless parable. It teaches us that the greatest risk is not in embracing the new, but in clinging too tightly to the old. It proves that the most formidable walls are not those that keep competitors out, but those that lock you in, blinding you to the inevitable dawn of a new reality. The empire did not fall to an outside invader. It was hollowed out from within by the one thing it could not bring itself to accept: the future. From the pinnacle of global dominance to the cold, sterile halls of a bankruptcy court, the story of Eastman Kodak is far more than a simple business case study. It is a modern epic, a Shakespearean tragedy played out not with kings and castles, but with corporate titans and chemical formulas. It stands as the definitive, monumental testament to a terrifying truth of our age, that the future does not arrive with a polite knock. It kicks down the door. The fall of this empire was not the result of a single bad decision, a faulty product, or a brilliant competitor. It was the result of a profound, systemic, and ultimately fatal inability to answer the most important question any successful entity must ask itself. Are we in the business of selling our product? Or are we in the business of fulfilling the Brechter's need that our product serves? Kodak believed with every fiber of its being that it was in the business of selling film. It had forgotten that it was truly in the business of helping people share their lives and preserve their memories. When a new, better, and fundamentally different way to do that appeared, they saw not an opportunity, but an existential threat to be contained, managed, and controlled. They failed to realize you cannot control a paradigm shift. You can only be swept away by it or learn to ride the wave. The ghost that Steven Sasson summoned in 1975 was not merely a filmless camera. It was a new philosophy of the image, a schism in the very nature of what a picture was. For a century, a photograph had been an artifact. It was a physical object, a sacred relic imbued with the magic of chemistry and light. It had weight, texture, and permanence. It lived in a shoebox, was enshrined in an album, or was framed on a mantelpiece. It was an anchor to the past, a destination. The Kodak moment was the ritual of creating this artifact. Kodak's entire universe, its colossal profits, and its cultural power, was built on the economics of this physicality, the atoms of silver, halide, paper, and dye. The digital image, by contrast, was an agent. It was ethereal, weightless, and infinitely fluid. It was not an object to be possessed, but a piece of information to be transmitted. It lived in the ether, on screens, and in signals. Its value was not in its permanence, but in its immediacy, its shareability, its frictionlessness. It was not a destination. It was a departure point for a conversation, a connection, a new memory. This was the fundamental philosophical divide that Kodak's leadership could never cross. They were master alchemists, experts in the world of atoms, but they were utterly illiterate in the new language of bits. While they were trying to convince the world to keep building physical libraries of memories, the world was discovering the exhilarating power of the instantaneous global conversation. This blindness was not born of incompetence, but of the intoxicating poison of success. The fortress they had built with its moat of patents and its walls of market share had become their prison. Every process, every quarterly report, every executive bonus was tied to the glorious, predictable, and wildly profitable engine of film sales. To truly embrace digital would have required an act of terrifying self-destruction. It would have meant willingly dismantling their most profitable division, rendering their most valuable factories obsolete, and cannibalizing their own core identity in favor of a new, unproven, and far less profitable venture. It is one of the cruelest ironies of business. The very things that make you successful create a cultural inertia so powerful that it prevents you from becoming something new. Kodak's leadership were not villains. They were stewards of a great kingdom, and their primary duty, as they saw it, was to protect that kingdom. They could not bring themselves to burn it to the ground in order to plant a new forest. So instead, they stood watch as the world changed around them, dutifully polishing the cannons on a battleship in an age that had just been redefined by the aircraft carrier. And so the legacy of Kodak is not written in its dusty patents or its abandoned factories, but in the stark, universal warning it offers to every dominant player in every industry today. The story is a mirror held up to the giants of our own time. From social media empires to search engine behemoths, from automotive titans to streaming media kings, the question remains the same. Are they selling the platform or the connection? Are they selling the car or the freedom of mobility? Are they selling the subscription or the power of the story? The Kodak moment is no longer just a nostalgic phrase. It is a strategic term, a shorthand for that critical, terrifying instant. When an organization is confronted with a disruptive future and must choose between the comfort of its own history and the pain of its own rebirth. The ghosts of blockbuster video, of Nokia, of countless other fallen titans all whisper the same cautionary tale. They remind us that market leadership is merely a temporary lease, and that the rent is a constant, ruthless, and often painful state of reinvention. Ultimately, the collapse of this great American icon was the end of an era in a way that went far beyond business. It marked the definitive transition of human memory itself, from the analog to the digital. The shoebox full of curled fading prints has been replaced by the infinite sterile perfection of the cloud. The communal ritual of the slideshow has been replaced by the solitary flick of a thumb across a glass screen. Something has been gained: immediacy, volume, convenience. But something has also been lost. A certain reverence for the captured image, a sense of its preciousness has faded. We now live in a deluge of images so numerous that they often lose their individual power. Kodak, for all its corporate failings, was the last great custodian of that older, more deliberate world. In the end, the story comes full circle back to that clumsy toaster-sized box and a flickering, ghostly image on a television screen. It was the first digital photograph, but it was also the first true Kodak moment of the new age. It was a fleeting, precious instant in time that held the seed of a monumental future. It was a moment that demanded to be seen, to be understood, and to be acted upon. But the men who witnessed it saw only a curiosity, a technical footnote. They failed to realize they were not looking at a flawed picture of a lab assistant. They were looking at a perfect, terrifyingly clear picture of their own obsolescence. The darkness they could not see through was not the darkness of the marketplace. It was the blinding glare of their own magnificent, unyielding, and ultimately fatal success.